How's it going, folks? David here, and today I'm joined with a very special guest, Marcel Ardons from the channel Lessons with Marcel. If you're starting out on guitar, coming to this instrument, then there's some things you have to think about a little bit differently for this 8-string wonder. And we're gonna share 10 tips for you guitar players picking up the mandolin for the first time. What's up, Marcel?
Not much, man. I told you earlier, I was just trying to figure out how to play the mandolin real quick so we could shoot this video.
Well, when you figure it out, let me know too.
Thanks so much for having me on here, man. I think I might be one of the freshest mandolin players that you've ever had on the channel. I mean, my mandolin career is, just a couple years long.
Man, it's an honor to have you on the channel because I love your picking, I love your content, and I know you have a special insight into the guitar psyche that will hopefully help us out with these tips as well.
Yeah, and if you want to see more of us hanging out too, me and David did shoot another video over on my channel, so go check it out. Yeah, something, one of these somewhere.
I always forget which corner. I think it's this one.
So yeah, the first thing I want to say about this tiny 8-string guitar is that it's basically the same as a normal guitar, just 2 more strings. And none of that's true. Don't be that guy. A lot of times guitar players pick up a mandolin and the first thing they think is like, oh, the lowest 4 strings on a guitar are E, A, D, G, and that's like the mandolin, but upside down. So if I think about how to make a G chord and then invert that, I can make a G chord on the mandolin. And that's probably the worst thing that you could do for yourself. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but it really does stunt your growth. And I did that for a long time. Musicality isn't about like quick cheats, right? Just learn the instrument. Don't try to cheat yourself out of learning the instrument. You'll be much more musical if you just think about it as a new instrument. Beyond the layout too, beyond just how the instrument works, I mean, it serves a completely different purpose in the band too. And I see a lot of guitar players do that too. They pick up the mandolin and they want to do, this kind of thing. And that's not really your job, man. This is your job. So don't think of the mandolin as a tiny guitar. Try to learn it as its own instrument, all the chord shapes, all the scales, all the licks. Think of it as a new thing. Forget about the guitar for as long as you can and just do this. And then watch other mandolin players to see what the role is in the group, because you're really not doing any of the same stuff. It'll challenge you too, because you're not used to doing the things that you need to do on the mandolin, and it'll actually make you think harder about music. And that's one of the wonderful things about picking up a second instrument.
So true. Yeah, and in tandem with that, I think listening to mandolin players in particular is really helpful just to get the sound, the ideal tone, and the timing that the professional mandolin players out there have. Whereas if you're just listening to guitar players, you're going to have a different interpretation of what that tone, what that sound is going to be. Nothing against guitar players, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally true, man. I remember the first time that I went to record something with my mandolin, it was just a chop track. It was just a rhythm track. And, if you've ever, recorded, you probably know about the grid, right? You can zoom in on the little waveforms of your recording, and you can see if you're lining up with the grid, if you're perfectly in time. And let me tell you, my mandolin chops were not in time because I had never had to do that job. The boom check of the guitar, not that it's not in time, but it's just it's a little bit looser of a thing. It's a little bit of a flubbier instrument, and the mandolin chop is so short and precise, that you really feel it if it's, just ahead or just behind the beat. And if you can't control it, man, you're in trouble. So yeah, it's a different instrument.
And that brings us to our second tip, which is maybe the most important tip, which is learning how to tune the mandolin, and especially being able to tune it by ear, because there's nothing worse than having...
Oh, don't do it. Honky tonk mandolin.
Really, I think the trick with tuning the mandolin over the guitar is that you're not tuning every string to the tuner. Even if you are using like a clip-on tuner like this one here, or if you're using an app or something like that, I think the most important thing is to make sure you have one string in tune and then tune the other string to that string. And you can really hear when the 2 strings are resonating together. You don't really hear that rub like you do when it's just a little bit out. And then once you have one set of strings in tune like this, it's pretty easy to tune the other strings as well, because you have these unisons and octaves on the fretboard. So once you have your G string in tune, your D string should sound like the 7th fret of your your G string.
I just want to see if you can really do this live, you know? Are we going to have to do 2 takes?
Maybe might have to. You can also check the octaves against your 5th fret of the higher sounding string. So like the 5th fret of your E string should sound like your open A. And it actually does there. I was actually kind of surprised that worked.
Can I ask you a question about when you're matching your courses of strings?
Oh, of course, yeah.
There's kind of different things that you hear. So if it's very out of tune, you hear the beat, right? You hear the sort of pulsing of it being out of tune, right? And I think as you get really close, there's a moment where it's really resonant when they're, you know, about the same or the same. And there's also a moment where it kind of deadens out. These are both right when you're really close, right? One's really resonant and one's like kind of dead, like the strings are canceling each other out, like a phase issue or something. Which one of those are you aiming for?
I think I'm trying to get to the point where they cancel each other out. I think I get this sensation too whenever I'm playing along with the recording, not necessarily talking about intonation, but trying to match a mandolin player note for a solo or a melody. I'm trying to get to that point where I can't hear the recording and I'm just like kind of hearing myself cancel out that other player. That's when I feel like I've really transcribed a tune or a solo well. I think it's the same idea with tuning. It's almost like you don't want to hear the different pairs. You want it to sound almost as if it was one string instead of 2, which I never really thought about that before. That's a really good question.
Well, no, it's basically what you said, right? If you tune them both to the tuner, they can have this really, you know, vibrant, overtony, like synchronicity thing. But if one of them is just in the sweet spot, then they sort of deaden each other out in this really nice way, and it feels more unison, even though one of them might be slightly out of tune or something. I'm not sure what it is. So here's something that is the same from, I mean, if you're a bluegrass guitar player going to mandolin, it is the same. And that's that you should be using hefty picks. This is tip number 3. So if you don't already use something like a blue chip or a tone slab, or, David, give me other brands.
Vegan or vegan picks. What other ones? Those are the good ones right there, I'd say.
Yeah, those are the good ones. And, you know, the interesting thing about the vegans, is that they're less popular with guitar players. I feel like that's almost like a mandolin exclusive kind of thing. I don't remember mandolin players playing those.
I do like them. Yeah, they have like kind of a little bit more of a thwacky sound. And then the blue chip has a little bit more of like a mwah kind of sound, if that makes sense. I don't know how to describe it.
It does make sense. I feel like the tone slab is a little rounder than the blue chip to me.
For mandolins in particular, trying to get that unison sound from the sets of strings, it's really important to have a pick that doesn't have any flex or any give in it when you push through, because you don't want to hear like this double like. Yeah. You really hear that with like some of the thinner picks. Like this is even, it's a triangle pick. It's a Clayton 1mm, and I usually play with kind of like a 1.3, 1.4 size, so it's just a little bit thinner, but like. Definitely here it's a lot thinner than like even the Vegan, which is a similar material but a lot thicker. You want to get past kind of like the plasticky sound of the pick or the metallic strings and be able to get more of the kind of wooden tone from the instrument itself, which is definitely a challenge on a bright sounding instrument like the mandolin.
You know, there's a couple things about playing with picks like these that if you're not from the bluegrass tradition might be helpful to you, and that is the thickness of the pick and the rigidity of the material are two different things. So you can imagine if you were playing with like a slice of ham, even if it was pretty thick, it'd have a lot of give to it, right?
I didn't know where you're going with that one.
if you think about something like a blue chip, even at the lower levels of thickness, they're still very rigid material. So think about that. David's right, though, right? It shouldn't have any give to it. The other thing about it not having any give to it, is that stresses some people out if they're not used to that, because they're used to that pick giving as they move through. And a lot of people have a pretty tight grip, and then that pick just flexes against the strings, and you're kind of doing a little bit of the opposite thing. I don't want to over-exaggerate or anything, but because the pick is so rigid, it might give a little more in your hand. At least as a guitar player, this is something that I say, I feel like this is a little less mandolin specific, but still true. If you were playing with a very rigid pick and you held it as tight as possible and you just push through all the strings, you'll just break all the strings at once. It has to give just a little bit in your hand, and that tends to make it a little bit easier to alternate pick and play your fiddle tunes and do all that stuff.
That's really tied into tip number 4 here, which is follow through both strings in the set, kind of like we were talking about earlier. But I used to take karate growing up, and I actually got to like brown belt, but I don't remember any of it anymore.
Okay, stop bragging.
The point is, we had to break boards occasionally when we were at karate practice. I don't know what you call it. But we had to break these boards, and they would always say, you don't punch at the board, you punch through the board in order to break it. And I think it's the same idea with the pick and the double courses of strings on the mandolin, where you're not trying to just hit the strings or get to the strings, you're really trying to follow through. And when you have that give in your pick, you're kind of sensing when the pick meets the strings, allowing the pick to make contact with the strings, flex, and then follow through in one fluid motion. And it's almost like you're aiming for the other side of the string instead of just at the string. A way to make this a little bit more apparent as a practice technique is to try using rest strokes. Maybe if you're playing your D major scale, seeing if you can follow through every single note and rest the pick on the next adjacent set of strings. And you're allowing the pick to move in your fingers on each direction, the downs and the ups there. Do guitarists ever do that too?
Yeah, they do. The rest stroke thing is kind of like a bluegrass conspiracy theory, where people are like, oh yeah, the reason why so-and-so's tone is so great is because everything is a rest stroke. And I doubt everything is a rest stroke.
No, definitely not. Yeah. That's kind of the danger too. If you take that too far, some people will think like, oh, how on earth do I play fast and allow the pick to rest on every adjacent set of strings? And that's not really the point. The point of the exercise is just kind of get inside that headspace of what it's like to follow through each set of strings. And then once you get used to that feeling, you don't have to rest. You can, fluidly change directions after every pick stroke. Our 5th tip here is find your anchor. And this one is a little bit open-ended because if you look at some of the great mandolin players out there, you see a lot of people do some different stuff with the right hand. Some people anchor on the bridge itself. Some people anchor with their extra fingers on the top of the instrument or on the pick guard. Some people don't anchor at all. And it's a little bit, scary and confusing at first because there's so many valid approaches to the right hand. What do you do for your right hand, Marcel?
Yeah, I anchor back here at the tailpiece, and I just get my pick out like that. And that gives me a lot of speed, fluidity, volume, all those things. So you just let me say it. No, my palm of the meat of my hand right here touches right back here. Is that normal?
I think so. That's what I would do. There's some great players out there who anchor like on the face of the instrument. Adam Steffi is someone who comes to mind who does this, where he puts his kind of ring finger on the face of the instrument. The danger with that, I think, is that you're having to kind of move your whole arm to get the pick motion like this, because you can't really bend your wrist quite as much to drive the pick through the strings. But, Adam Steffi's like a multi-Grammy winning award mandolin players who can argue with that. And, if you like his playing, then you should definitely try to model your right hand after him. Also, some people try to plant just behind the bridge like this and just use the wrist, I should say. And, Chris Thiele does a lot of this, although he changes things up with his right hand. For me, I don't know. I didn't have a mandolin teacher growing up, so I just tried a bunch of different things. And what made sense to me was to try to use both the wrist and the forearm, having an anchor for your arm on the armrest here, or if you don't have an armrest, just on the side of the mandolin. And then, I kind of rub the bottom of my wrist here against the back of the bridge. Not on the bridge, but just behind it on the strings there for more of a floating reference. That way you can see, where the last E string is and the last G string and still have a point of reference to meet the strings with the pick.
It's very similar to what I do on guitar too. That part of my hand touches my bridge pins. And but it's not, like you said, it's not about applying pressure and locking in necessarily, this technique that you're talking about. People do that. People do apply pressure and lock in, or they do it with their fingers like you were talking about. I'll be a little less diplomatic than David, and I'll say my problem with that technique is that, especially on guitar, is that it feels like wasted energy.
Yeah.
Like, why are you applying so much pressure and pushing on it like it's a gas pedal when it's not going to make you play faster? You could put all that energy into playing the instrument, not into pressing on the top or pressing on that bridge. All right, the next tip that we have is the mandolin fingering. That's 2 frets per finger. And I just told this story to David, but I'll tell it again. I was doing a transcription live stream. Someone asked me to transcribe some mandolin, and I got in there transcribing the mandolin, doing all of my guitar fingering, and I got roasted. And so I decided to figure out the right way to do it. This is my understanding of the rules as someone who's never been taught the rules. Here we go. So each finger does cover 2 frets. Your index finger would cover 1st and 2nd, for instance, 3rd and 4th, 5 and 6. Your pinky really only covers 7. I don't think I've seen a 7/8 situation.
Yeah, not very often. Not very often, for sure, yeah.
And the easiest way, I think, at least for me, when I was learning how to do this, to picture this, is with your normal chop chord. If you look at, like, the big boy G chop chord, all of the fingers are in the correct zone. This isn't always true for chords, but this chord is a really good example of it. You can see this is in its zone, that's in its zone, this is in its zone, the pinky's up there at 7. That made sense to me. This is basically what I modeled everything after.
I've actually never thought of that before. That's a brilliant idea. That's awesome.
This would be kind of a first position kind of thing. As you move up the neck and you keep replacing fingers with a new finger, you're entering different positions. And I don't know if it's exactly the same as on guitar, but on guitar, we just named the position that our index finger is over. But I don't think that's true on mandolin. How do the positions work for mandolin?
Usually when you're playing a closed position, you kind of start with the root on one of your 4 fingers. And there's this fancy thing called the 4-finger closed position that a lot of nerdy mandolin players talk about, where, basically you can start the scale with your root on any one of those 4 and get a different shape. And another reason why we kind of stick to that 2 frets per finger spacing in the first position is how these closed scales work out. Like, for instance, if you were to play a closed position A scale, even just your first octave right here, having your index finger on the root, you get this really beautiful shape where you're just laying down one finger after the other as you go up the scale. And you don't have to worry about, just doing 3 fingers on one string or 2 fingers on another. It's always going to be 4 fingers per string before you move up to the next one. Just like that. And it'd be the same thing, if you were to start on, say, your ring finger on the root. If you start right here on the 7th fret of your D string, it doesn't lay out quite as symmetrically because you're just seeing kind of partial shapes on the D and the E string. But if you were to keep going higher and lower, you're still using 4 fingers per string. So that's why, it makes sense to have 2 frets of territory for your fingers, especially down here in the first position with open strings.
Definitely. That's the move. Throw out your guitar fingering. It's useless here. We don't want it.
Get out of here, B string. Tip number 7 here is kind of related. It's about angling your fingers on the fretboard. And I see a lot of folks who start on guitar, especially classical guitar, will kind of finger the fretboard like this, where your fingers are parallel to the frets. And oftentimes, people place their thumb behind the neck like this and leave a big space underneath the neck, because that's how a lot of classical guitar players do it. I'm not sure about flat pickers. Is that the case with flat pickers?
Oh, yeah, that kind of thing? I mean, I do that, yeah.
Well, this is definitely a big difference in the mandolin world, because I think we take more of our pedagogy from the violin world instead of the guitar world here, since we're, dealing with a fretboard and strings that are similar to a violin. We're kind of holding our left hand more similar to how a fiddle player or a violinist would. And that's where we're kind of like pinching the neck between our thumb and index here. And once you've got that pinch going on down here at the nut, we're just kind of laying our fingers down at an angle like this. It's almost at a 45-degree angle to the frets. And the reason why we do this is that it makes it easier to have that 2 frets per finger spacing. If your fingers are parallel to the frets, it becomes a lot harder to stretch out and get the same finger spacing that we're talking about. Whereas if you angle your fingers over like this, it becomes much easier to reach back with your index and also reach up with your pinky.
Man, everything that you just said is so interesting to me. I never thought about it that way.
Really?
But good for me. I do all those things. But yeah, I never noticed how much different my technique is on the guitar. I assume it's just from hanging out with so many mandolin players over the years. All right, our next tip is to learn to think in different keys. If you're a guitar player, especially if you're a bluegrass guitar player, you probably use your capo all the time. And it's not that you can't capo on mandolin, but it's just that if you do, you won't look cool. And music is about looking cool.
That's what I always say.
No, you can capo on the mandolin, but it's not a very bluegrassy thing. In fact, I think mandolin in a lot of folk styles doesn't involve a capo. And because you don't have as many strings and your job is different, you really don't need a capo. So you have to learn how to play all these songs in different keys. So you should definitely think about maybe working in the keys that you're familiar with. So learning things in G, and C, and D, and A. All of those sort of like cage system keys, if you're a guitar player, are great to start in on the mandolin. You will find that A and D are much better than they are on the guitar. But then after that, all the other keys that you have to learn are basically closed positions of keys that you've already learned, moved up or down a couple half steps, right? For instance, guitar players might be a little scared to play in like B without a capo. But for a mandolin player, it's really just the key of C, move down a fret. I mean, sure, there's other considerations, there's some different stuff, but it's very similar. And it saves you from having to do a lot of math if you can learn those common keys and then learn how to scoot them around.
Yeah, even that like closed position A major scale that we looked at earlier. If you just move that whole shape up the neck one fret, you've got like a B flat major scale, which is kind of a scary key to play in if you're not used to playing without a capo. So you have these reliable shapes that you can count on, and the symmetry of the strings tuned in fifths is such a handy thing. Oh my goodness, you're so right. I don't know why it's such a faux pas to use a capo on the mandolin. I've never even thought about the history of that, when that became such a bad thing, the forbidden capo. But
they still do in some Irish styles, don't they? Isn't it less banned?
I think you might be right. Some like early mandolin playing in Celtic music, and even in bluegrass there are some exceptions, like Sierra Hull, an amazing mandolin player, one of my favorite players ever. She does some stuff on the mandolin with the capo, but that's where she's using some wacky tuning, like stuff off of her Weighted Mind record where it's just mandolin and bass. There's a lot more room to do whatever you want to do with the instrument. But at the Bluegrass Jam, you're going to get some weird looks if you pull out a capo.
And even Sierra Hull, she had to climb a mountain and converse with the mandolin elders to get permission. And she just barely got it,
That's right.
So our next tip is that you need to learn your chop chords. There's two big chop chords that you need to know. That's the 4-string chop chord and the 3-string chop chord, right? Basically, if you're stretching that pinky or you're not stretching that pinky, you end up using these all the time, and they're an incredibly useful movable chord shape. If you're a guitar player, it's kind of like the power chord of the mandolin. But the neat thing is that power chords don't have a quality like major or minor, but the chop chords do. And the neat thing about it too is they allow you to make very percussive sounds. So you've probably heard sort of floaty mandolin. Go ahead, join me on the Fox intro. But the chop chord, right, is a chord that you can turn off with your left hand, right? You can turn it on with the strum, and then you can stop it with that hand. You can get these very tight percussive sounds that are great for replacing, for instance, like a snare drum on 2 and 4 in a pop act, which is basically what Bill Monroe did in bluegrass. You can create drive, you can create backbeat just like a drummer would do, but on a mandolin. And I do this all the time, even without playing bluegrass. I have friends that I play country music with, and they just want to sing classic country and pop country tunes, I'll bring my mandolin over so I can basically be the drummer.
I think people credit Bill Monroe with coming up with these shapes. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it definitely is so tied to bluegrass music, and it's a sound that you want to be able to replicate even if you don't play bluegrass, because there's a lot of helpful shapes that are built into the chop chord that you can even use for melody stuff, like those are notes in my mind tied to this shape and how the chord tones line up with this figuration. And just because they're movable, you can take that same lick and move it up 2 frets higher to your A chord, play the same lick over your A chord. Now it's kind of like a huge device that a lot of mandolin players use. And it's a little bit challenging at first if you're stressed out by making this tricky shape, especially your G chop chord, which is the biggest stretch out of all the chop chords, except for maybe your F sharp chop chord. Don't do that one. To make it a little bit easier, what I like to tell people is to start higher up the neck. Like maybe start here with your B major chop chord, which is the 11th, the 9th, the 6th, and the 7th frets. Just because the frets are smaller and it's a little bit easier to manage up there. And then you can slowly move it back down to that G chord as well.
Man, what is that chord? 11, 9, 6, 7? That's, well, the 6 is really just the 13, so that's just a 13 chord. That's a little music theory joke for you.
Our last tip here is to use mandolin-specific techniques when you're playing. And I feel like there's stuff that you do on the mandolin that you don't hear guitar players, even flat pickers, do quite as much. For instance, there's tremolo, right? And that's a huge thing that Monroe did in bluegrass, where you're playing multiple notes on a single pitch. Which, maybe you do hear some guitar players do that, like Michael Daves does that from time to time, right? Some other players.
He does it because he's a Monroe-style guitar player, though.
Tremolo is like a huge way of, buffing up your sustain and, making things sound a little bit more like the instrument rather than you're just a guitar player playing the mandolin. I feel like Michael Daves being the exception. And then there's all sorts of other stuff, like cross picking is something that you do on guitar as well. But there's the amazing McReynolds style cross picking that Jesse McReynolds pioneered back in the day, using different ups and down strokes to kind of get some unique sounds on the mandolin. Like that's the basic one that I know, where you're doing down on the D string for like this G major double stop, and then doing an up across the E and the A strings before doing another down on the D string. And then kind of finishing out that roll with another down up, much like a forward roll that you might hear on the banjo. I remember that pioneering women of bluegrass, the Hazel and Alice record, David Grisman plays mandolin on that, and it sounds like he just figured out how to do that because he plays it underneath every verse. It's like his fill of choice is to play that McReynolds style of cross-picking. Oh, it's so good. And it's got a unique sound that I feel like is different than if you just alternate, right? Like that's alternating, and then this is the McReynolds style. Kind of get like more momentum on those consecutive upstrokes, I feel like. Does anyone ever do that on guitar as well? I'm curious.
No, everyone on guitar does down, down, up. They do George Scheffler cross-picking. It's pretty rare to see 2 ups in a row. I mean, off the top of my head, I can only think of Church Street Blues has 2 ups in a row. It just doesn't happen that much, though.
Another mandolin-specific technique that a lot of players use is double stops. And actually, that's exactly what we talked about in this other video that me and Marcel did. So we won't go too far into it. If you want to check out what we talked about, you can check out that link in the cards above, description down below as well. Lots of really useful things that you can use to map out the fretboard, even play some melodies. All sorts of fun stuff like that we'll leave for our other video. But that about wraps up our 10 tips for guitar players learning the mandolin for the first time. Any other sage advice that you would give, Marcel, before coming to a close?
Don't worry about learning the mandolin part to Atlantic City. It's not worth it.
Losing my religion, though? I don't know. Maybe that one.
That one's pretty good.
Thanks so much for doing this, Marcel. It was a blast getting to hang out. And go check out Marcel's channel if you haven't already. Absolutely love his stuff. He's been a huge inspiration for my channel and huge inspiration for the bluetuber community in general. So many cool things, even if you don't play guitar, which I guess you probably would if you're watching this video, but you know, there's all sorts of amazing stuff. I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you so much, man. Yeah, I hope to see you all over there.